January 10th, 1862. It is Inauguration Day in Sacramento, and the capital of California is underwater. The streets are a lake. Boats move where wagons should be. In a few hours, a new governor named Leland Stanford will be rowed to his own swearing-in, and afterward, he will climb back into the governor's mansion through a window on the second story because the front door is submerged. It has been raining for weeks. Out beyond the drowned city, the whole Central Valley has become an inland sea 300 miles long, and the water is still rising. California has always known it lives in the shadow of one great catastrophe. It waits for the earthquake. It calls that the big one, and it plans its whole imagination around the day the ground finally moves. But the disaster drowning the capital that winter is not the one they fear. It is water. And by every measure that matters, how likely it is, how much it costs, how many it kills, it is the larger threat. The scientists who study it now call it California's other big one, and they will tell you it is not a story about the past. It is a warning that has been sitting in the sediment in the history books, waiting. This flood will kill roughly 4,000 people, bankrupt the state, and then be almost completely forgotten for 160 years. And everything we have learned since says it is coming back. Bigger, costlier, and more likely than it has ever been. This is the story of the other big one, the flood that will drown California for good. To understand what is coming, you have to go back to a winter that almost no one alive remembers, and to a truth that the most disaster-prepared state in America has spent more than a century trying not to think about. California is a place built around two fears. It fears fire, and it fears drought. Its dams and canals, its politics, and its headlines all point in one direction, toward the terror of too little water. Children there learn to drop and cover for the earthquake. Families keep a kit for the fire. Everyone knows the phrase the big one, and everyone means the same thing by it, a great rupture of the San Andreas Fault that will one day shake the cities on the coast. But the scientists who study these things have quietly concluded that the earthquake is not the worst thing that can happen to California. There's another big one. It is more likely than the Great Quake. It could cost several times as much, and when it comes, it will not shake the state for a minute and then stop. It will sit on top of California for weeks, and it will do something the fire and the drought never could. It will fill the middle of the state with water until the Central Valley becomes an inland sea. The government has a name for it. In the year 2010, the United States Geological Survey published a formal scenario for this disaster and called it Arc Storm for Atmospheric River 1000. On paper, it reads like the plot of a film. A train of storms parks over the state. About 50 levees give way. A quarter of every building in California takes flood damage. 1.5 million people are told to leave. The losses run to $750 billion, and by the newest estimates, to $1 trillion. And here is the part that turns a forecast into a warning. This is not something the scientists invented. It is something they reconstructed. Because the megaflood is not a story about what might happen. It is a story about what already did. The reason California can drown in the first place is written into the shape of the land. Down the middle of the state runs the Central Valley, a nearly flat floor about 450 miles long. On its eastern side stands the Sierra Nevada, a wall of granite that climbs above 14,000 feet. On its western side run the Coast Ranges. Between them lies a long, low basin, and that basin has exactly one narrow door to the sea, a gap at San Francisco Bay, where two great river systems, the Sacramento in the north and the San Joaquin in the south, squeeze together through a maze of channels called the Delta and finally reach the ocean. Think of it as a bathtub the size of a state, with a mountain range for a faucet and a single drain the width of a doorway. In an ordinary winter, this works. The rain falls, the snow piles up on the peaks, and the water is released slowly through the spring. But when too much water arrives too fast, the valley cannot empty itself. The rivers rise together, the one narrow outlet cannot keep up, and the water simply spreads across the floor and stays. At the southern end of the valley sits an even more perfect trap. It is called the Tulare Lake Basin, a low depression with no natural outlet to the ocean at all. Before farmers drained it for cropland, Tulare Lake was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River. Take the fields away, send it a wet enough winter, and the lake does the only thing water in a closed basin can do. It comes back. On top of this geography, California has spent 160 years making itself more vulnerable, not less. It drained its natural flood basins and built farms and towns on the valley floor. It walled its rivers behind roughly 13,000 miles of levees, many of them old, many privately built, few of them designed for a true catastrophe. Sacramento, the state capital, sits right where the Sacramento and American rivers meet, which makes it one of the most flood-prone big cities in the country, second only to New Orleans. In the last great flood, about 500,000 people lived in all of California. Today, nearly 40 million do. The water that fills the bathtub does not come from an ordinary storm. It comes from a river in the air. High above the Pacific, narrow ribbons of concentrated water vapor stream out of the tropics and race toward the coast. Scientists call them atmospheric rivers, and the name is close to literal. A single average one carries about as much water as flows out of the mouth of the Mississippi River. The strongest carry up to 15 times that. When one of these ribbons lines up and aims itself at California from the warm water near Hawaii, forecasters have an old nickname for it. They call it the Pineapple Express. One atmospheric river is just a wet winter storm. It rolls in, it dumps rain on the coast and snow on the mountains, and it moves on. The state depends on these storms. A handful of them deliver most of California's water for the year. The disaster is what happens when they stop moving on. When the pattern locks, and one atmospheric river follows another, all aimed at the same coast for days and then weeks, the storms stop being a blessing and become a siege. The ground saturates until it can hold nothing more. The rivers fill and overtop. And because these storms are warm, they do something worse than rain. They melt the snowpack that is already on the mountains. So the Sierra sheds months of stored water all at once. On top of everything already falling from the sky, the faucet and the drain fail together. That is the megaflood. And California has run this exact experiment before, in real life, with real people standing in the water. The rain began in the closing weeks of 1861. At first it looked like a generous winter, then it did not stop. Beginning around Christmas of that year and running well into January of 1862, storm after storm rolled off the Pacific and stalled over California. By the reckoning of scientists who have studied it since, it rained with almost no relief for about 43 days. The totals defy belief even now. Across parts of the state, the storms delivered the equivalent of 10 feet of water in rain and snow. Every river in the Central Valley left its banks at once, and then the separate floods joined, and the valley became a single body of water. Eyewitnesses and later reconstructions describe an inland sea about 300 miles long and as much as 20 miles wide. In places, the water stood as much as 30 feet high, enough to swallow whole the telegraph poles that had just been strung across the state. It was not only California. The same run of storms drowned Oregon, flooded Nevada and Utah and Arizona, and pushed water down into Mexico. It remains the largest flood in the recorded history of the American West. But it was California, with its brand new cities on the valley floor, that had built the most directly in the water's path. The sequence that winter is the same one the government's modern scenario spells out step by step. First, an early run of storms soaks the ground and fills the rivers. Then, the main event arrives, a procession of warm, heavy atmospheric rivers over a week or two, delivering somewhere between 15 and 35 inches of rain across wide areas, and far more than that in the mountains. The saturated ground turns every hillside into runoff. The reservoirs built to catch floods fill to their limits and have to let water go. And the levees, already leaning against the flood, begin to fail one after another, until the valley is drowning from the rivers in front and the broken levees behind. Now, imagine you are standing in the Capitol as it happens. It is January of 1862 and Sacramento is going under. The water rises in the streets until it reaches the second stories of the downtown buildings. It does not rush through and drain away. It fills the city and sits there, day after day, week after week. Boats move where wagons used to. Livestock drowns in the streets. Families climb to their rooftops and wait. The young state's proud capital has become a lake with buildings standing in it. On the 10th of January, in the middle of all this, California is supposed to inaugurate a new governor. His name is Leland Stanford, and one day he will build a railroad empire and a university that still carries his family's name. But today he is simply a man trying to reach his own swearing-in through a flooded city. By the accounts handed down, he travels to the ceremony by rowboat. When he finally returns to the governor's mansion, the ground floor is underwater and he climbs in through a window on the second story. The machinery of an entire state seizes up. The legislature meets, looks out at the water, and gives up, packing itself off to San Francisco until the summer. California cannot collect taxes from a drowned economy, and the treasury runs dry. For roughly a year and a half, the state simply cannot pay its bills. A modern nation-state economy, one of the largest in the world today, was in that winter brought to a complete stop by rain. And this is where you have to hold two pictures in your mind at once. That happened to a frontier state of 500,000 people. The scenario the scientists have written asks a simple, terrible question. What happens when the same water falls on 40 million? We know what that winter looked like from the ground, because one man wrote it all down. His name was William Brewer, a scientist trained at Yale who was crossing California on foot and horseback to survey it for the state. All that winter and spring he wrote long letters to his brother back east. And those letters survive as the closest thing we have to a camera pointed at the disaster. He described the valley as an almost continuous sheet of water, reaching, in his words, from the mountains on one side to the Coast Range hills on the other. He wrote of farms gone under, of houses floating off their foundations, of drowned cattle and horses turning in the current. In one passage, he wrote that nearly every house and farm over that immense region was gone. Brewer was not a man given to hysteria. He was a careful observer with a notebook, and that is exactly what makes his account so frightening. He was not describing a single flooded town. He was describing a flood you could not see across, one that had erased the works of an entire society and left the survivors clinging to whatever high ground they could find. Put his letters next to the image of the incoming governor rowing to his own inauguration, and you have the whole shape of it. The flood did not just damage California, it unmade it for a season, and then the rains eased, the water finally drained back toward the sea, the survivors rebuilt on the same valley floor, and the memory began to fade almost immediately. There was no film of it, there was no one left, a lifetime later who had waded through it, and a disaster no one remembers is a disaster no one prepares for. The water fell hardest, as it almost always does, on the people who had the least. Native communities living along the rivers lost their homes, their stored food, and their crops in the first days, swept away with everything else in the low ground. Far to the east, in the Owens Valley, the same brutal winter destroyed the game and the wild plant harvest that the Paiute people depended on to survive. Starving and watching cattle that had been driven into the valley eat the very plants they needed, they began to kill the cattle, and the fighting that followed became known as the Owens Valley Indian War. The flood did not just drown farms, it tore through the last threads of the world that had existed in California before the miners and the ranchers came. It broke the ranchers too. 1/4 of all the cattle in California, out of a herd of roughly 800,000, drowned or starved that winter. The wool growers reported another 100,000 sheep and 500,000 lambs lost. The great Mexican-era ranchos, land empires measured in tens of thousands of acres, never recovered. The flood did not only kill people and animals, it reached into the economy and the ownership of the land itself, and rearranged who would hold California in the century to come. When the counting was finally done, the winter of 1861 and 62 had killed an estimated 4,000 people. In a state of 500,000, that was close to 1 in every 100 human beings alive there. And then, astonishingly, the country moved on and mostly forgot. More than a century later, a group of scientists decided that forgetting was a mistake the state could not afford to make twice. Led out of a hazards project at the United States Geological Survey, and championed by researchers who had spent their careers trying to make people take earthquakes seriously, they built a detailed scientific scenario for a modern repeat of 1862. They called it Arc Storm, and the point of it was blunt. California treats the Great Earthquake as the disaster to plan for. The scientists wanted to show, in hard numbers, that the flood was the equal of the quake, and by some measures, the greater threat. The numbers they produced are staggering. In the scenario, a weeks-long assault of atmospheric rivers breaks roughly 50 levees. The Central Valley floods along a stretch 300 miles long and at least 20 miles wide, in places more than 10 feet high, exactly the footprint of the historical event. A full quarter of all the buildings in the state suffer flood damage. Around 1.5 million people are ordered to evacuate from the valley and the delta. Major highways, the great north-south arteries that hold the state together, go underwater and cut California in two. Power, water, sewer, and fuel systems fail across whole regions. Hillsides stripped bare by past wildfires collapse into mudslides. And because the water sits in a basin with that one narrow drain, it does not leave in days. Parts of the valley stay flooded for weeks, even months. That is why the price tag is so enormous, on the order of $725 billion in the first version of the scenario, and around $1 trillion in the updated one. That is more than 5 times the cost of Hurricane Katrina, and larger than the projected loss from a great earthquake on the southern San Andreas. There is one more number in the scenario that should worry anyone who lives there. Of all that damage to homes and farms and businesses, only a small fraction, something like 5 to 8 cents on every dollar, would be covered by insurance. Flood insurance is rare in the places that would drown, because those places do not think of themselves as flood country. So most of the loss would fall directly on families and on the public purse. The scientists had set out to answer a question, and the answer was that the other big one was bigger, and that almost no one was covered for it. If all of this still feels like a story from a computer, the winter of 2023 offered a small, real preview. A run of atmospheric rivers slammed into California that year, one after another, in exactly the pattern the scenario describes, though nowhere near the scale of a true megaflood. And in the Southern Valley, something happened that stopped people cold. Tulare Lake, the lake that had been drained and farmed for more than a century, came back. Water spread across more than 114,000 acres of what had been cropland the year before. Hundreds of homes and farm buildings went under. Communities were evacuated. A body of water that had been erased from the maps simply reappeared where the geography said it belonged. Matt Watkins, who led the Farm Bureau in Tulare County, described the scramble to save what could be saved. We had roughly 60,000 cows, he said, that had to be relocated because of the floods. 60,000 animals moved ahead of a lake that was not supposed to exist anymore. And that was the small version. That was a wet winter, not the once-in-a-lifetime siege. It refilled one closed basin at the bottom of the state, and it was still enough to drown farms and force families from their homes. It was the land quietly reminding California of its own shape, and of the fact that a drained lake never really leaves. It only waits. The most unsettling finding is not about the past at all. It is about the odds going forward, and they are moving in the wrong direction. In the year 2022, a climate scientist named Daniel Swain, working with a researcher named Xingying Huang, published an updated study that reran the megaflood for a warming world. They modeled two versions, one built on the old climate and one built on the warmer one we are moving into. Their central conclusion was stark. The warming that has already happened has roughly doubled the likelihood of a megaflood on the scale of 1862. And every additional degree the planet warms raises that risk further. The physics behind it is simple enough to state in a sentence. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, which means the atmospheric rivers of the future can carry more water and dump more rain, and more of that precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, running off immediately instead of waiting frozen on the peaks. The engine that drove the flood is being fed more fuel. Layer that onto the geologic record, and the picture sharpens. Buried in the sediments of California's coastal seabed and its valley floor are the fingerprints of past megafloods, and they show that floods on this scale have struck the region roughly every 1 to 200 years for thousands of years, with even larger ones further back in the record. The last great one was more than 160 years ago. In any given year now, scientists put the odds of the scenario at something like 1 in 50 and rising. Over the lifetime of the levees and the cities standing in the valley today, that is not a remote chance. That is a near certainty waiting for its winter. So here is where we stand. The flood that drowned California once is not a legend. It is a documented event, written down by a Yale scientist in letters to his brother, recorded in the story of a governor rowing to his inauguration, still legible in the drowned herds in the moved Capitol and the ruined ranchos. It happened. The only thing unusual about it is that so many people have been allowed to forget, and everything we have learned since says it will happen again. The valley is still a bathtub with one drain. The rivers in the sky still form and stall over the coast. The levees were not built to hold this, and the reservoirs cannot store it, and the warning window is short because the difference between a wet winter and a catastrophe is only a matter of how many storms line up and how warm they are. What has changed is that there are now 40 million people, and $1 trillion of everything sitting inside the flood zone, and a warming atmosphere loading the odds year by year. None of this means California is doomed to drown helplessly. The same science that reconstructed the disaster can forecast the atmospheric rivers days ahead, which buys time to manage the reservoirs and move people. Levees can be raised. Floodplains can be given back to the water so it has somewhere to go. The hardest part is not the engineering. It is the imagination, getting a state that fears fire and drought to believe that its single greatest natural threat may be the thing it has trained itself never to expect: water. The 1862 flood proves it can happen. The physics proves it will. The only open question left is whether California decides to treat the megaflood as history or as a forecast. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. Documentaries like this take real time to research, to check, and to put together, and it means a great deal that you chose to spend this time here. If the story stayed with you, take a second to like it, to leave a comment with your own thoughts, and to subscribe, so you are there for the next one. Until then, stay safe, keep an eye on the sky, and I'll see you in the next one.